All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to River Falls Days and the River Falls Public Library. I am Alice Olson. We're going to get going right away with our presenter. We've got a lot of information to cover tonight, and we want to make sure we have time for discussion. I'm just going to introduce Dan. Dan Geister's family has been in Pierce County since 1854, when his third great-grandfather, Samuel Geister, came to Prescott. Dan himself was born in River Falls and grew up in Hudson, Roberts, and River Falls, graduating from River Falls High School and UWRF. Since 2015, he worked in the Stillwater School District and the Mathnasium Tutoring Center. In 2006, Dan got the local history bug when he and his father were looking for history of the Beldenville area. With the support of the Pierce County Historical Association and editing help from Ursula Peterson, within 2 years he had compiled his research and published a book, The History of Beldenville. With help from Pat Morey, his second book, which was on the history of Ellsworth, was written and published in 2013. Since volunteering with the River Falls Historic Preservation Commission to research and create historical plaques along Main Street, River Falls, Dan's genealogy knowledge has expanded throughout the Pierce County area. Along with Jane Hoffman, Dan is currently researching for a History of River Falls book to be published in 2028-2029. In the theme of the United States of America semi-quincentennial, Dan's talk this evening will focus on the earliest decade River Falls was a community. Welcome, Dan Geister.
Thank you. I want to start with just saying a lot of this stuff would not be possible without the UWRF archives, Pierce County Historical Association, Wisconsin Historical Society. I made a faux pas a little bit, and I didn't really credit a lot of these pictures, but that's a lot where they came from, but not all where they came from. Ursula was my mentor, and if you knew Ursula Peterson, she did a great job of capturing, and so she's the one who's collected stuff since the 1970s, so that's it. Jane Hoffman, as she said, is going to do a book with me about history of River Falls. She did these displays. So to start off with here, if you haven't seen the displays at the library, that talks about everything before settlement. Now I'm going to talk about the 1850s primarily, when things are settled. I have a lot of specific notes, so if I'm not looking at you as the audience every time, that's because I don't want to get things wrong. So where do we start with? Of course, this area was a home for indigenous people for many, many thousands of years. We cannot find a ton about them because they didn't leave a written record. Once we started to have settlement, then there was more written records. Let's go back a little bit. So this area, the Treaty of Paris in 1783, was when the Revolutionary War was ended. This became part of the Northwest Territory in 1787. In 1819 to 1836, this area was Crawford County, Michigan. And then from 1836 to 40, it became Wisconsin Territory. St. Croix County was on my birthday, but it's not that year. I wasn't born in 1840, but in 1840 on my birthday, it became St. Croix County, including Stillwater as the county seat. There were other places along the river that were developing in the 1840s. Philander Prescott had a trading post at Prescott starting in 1840, about to 1846 there was a ferry started regular service at Prescott. 1848 was the first steamboat landings regular times at Prescott, Hudson, Stillwater, Taylor's Falls, all those places along the St. Croix River. This picture here is from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and it's the falls before there was any dam put in along the Kinnickinnick River. So let's get a baseline for the 1850s. As you can read back there, I'm not going to go into great detail, but there were surveys done of this area in the late 1840s, 1847, 1848. It talks about the surveyors back there as well. And that's the surveying map there. You can see in section 1 where we are in the city, there are falls mentioned on those original surveying maps. Up atop here to get a base of 1850, this is the names that were in the River Falls area in 1850. This woman, born October 1st, 1850, is probably the first white person born in the Kinnickinnic Valley. That was on October 1st, 1850. So she was actually her father was named Elijah Fish, and they're on the census record there, along with the family of Livingston. So they were speculating here, and they actually left the area before 1855. They went through Bad Axe, Wisconsin, and she lived most of her life near Lansing, Iowa. So there wasn't much about here. But Joel Foster, if you ever heard of History of River Falls, he had a reminiscence, and he wrote about these people that the Livingstons and the Fish were speculating together. So, and there's the boundary of what St. Croix County was between 1850, beginning of the year, to 1853 when the three counties split, Polk, St. Croix, and Pierce. Of course, we're mostly in Pierce, but St. Croix County is very close, so we'll be right there. Let's go to slide 2 or 3. Okay, we have to start with Foster. He is credited as being the first settler, and I don't doubt that at all, but a lot of his story was put out by himself. There is no other point of view on Foster's story. He wrote it for the River Falls Press during the centennial year of the United States. In 1876, he submitted it week to week, and that's where it originally appeared. In 1881, it was compiled into a book, History of Washington County. So a little bit about Foster. Joel Foster, if you never heard of him, is the first white settler of this area. He was born in 1814. He's the youngest of 11. His father, Noah, was a miller. His mother died when he was 10. The family moved to Madison, Illinois around 1830. They went from up in the New England area to New York, specifically 2 teams along the National Road from Baltimore to St. Louis. He worked at a store in the 30s. He quit school in 1832. So that would be when he's about 17. That's not a big deal there. He was a farmer, a ferrymaster, and a sawmill down in Illinois. In the late 1840s, his health was not good, and so he thought idea was to join the Mexican War in 1847-48. He actually did well in the Mexican War. He was promoted to second lieutenant. He thought the water and air was not as good as in Illinois. So he decided to leave Illinois after that and maybe go to Texas. He didn't end up going to Texas. According to his account, he contacted his nephew, Eli Lewis, to check out the steamboat or the St. Croix Valley. The steamboat Senator he came up on in the fall of 1848. It was a 27-day trip. He landed at Stillwater, Minnesota, and he heard about this valley in a saloon there. Where is this land? Where are the falls? Yes, stranger, there are falls here. So he went to Hudson to check it out. He actually met 2 people in Hudson at that time called Buena Vista, Milton and William Nobles. He knew them from before. He hunted for a while, and he was told there was no trout in the Kinnickinnic River, but the Rush River was good. So he did come here instead to the Kinnickinnic River, and he was impressed. He thought it was the best natural advantage of any other point in the valley. He camped at Clifton, sailed down to Prescott on the St. Croix River, and got on a steamboat. He went back home, and he came back right away with this guy here. This is AI, but this is a depiction. We obviously don't have any pictures from the 1840s, and that's not the way the Kinney looked exactly, but that's his marriage picture in the middle top. That's in the 1850s. That's our oldest known picture of Foster. And then these are just like an idea of what was going on. So they went down to the falls, and they with Dick. He was born, if you can see there, in 1829 about, so he's about 15 years younger than Joel Foster. And they spent the winter down by the junction of the Kinnickinnick and the South Fork. They stayed there. They made a little hunt there. They kept their supplies in a warehouse at Hudson. There was like maybe 2 stores in Hudson, something like that, in 1848. And they would go up there and borrow like a horse or something to go up to the supplies, come back and forth during that first winter. Then when they left, they went back to Illinois in 1849, early 1849. And then they actually came back and built Fort Foster. That's what this is here. This is not down by the river at all. This is really prairie land it's supposed to be, but it's on the right there. It was up more by the armory. That's where the original Fort Foster was built, where they would welcome visitors that would eventually come, because they could see this monument, if you know where that is. And you can't really see that from anywhere close by here. You have to be out that direction. June 10th, 1849, they returned with 4 horses. Supposedly there was only 2 around in the valley, 2 cows, 3 dogs, 12 chickens, a plow, and $7. They planted some oats, potatoes, and then this is when some of the other families will get involved. Dick never returned to River Falls area. After 49, he supposedly fell in love with somebody and stayed down there. We don't even know like who he married exactly or what he did or anything like that. Nobody even knew his last name. In his reminiscence, they don't name his last name. So in 1850, Joel Foster was here by himself, and the first 4th of July with other people, which I'll talk about in a little bit, was supposedly a dinner with a roast pig at Foster's. That was according to Foster's memoir from 1876. Joel would get married in 1856 and have 5 children that lived around the area. And that's why the Foster family is the only family from this period that still is in this area of River Falls. We're going to go to this. These are 2 brothers. On the left is Nathaniel Powell. He's the older brother. He was born in 1827. The right is Oliver Powell. He was born in 1831. I'll talk about these 2 ladies in just a little bit. They came from St. Lawrence County, New York. I marked it here on this map. So in the upper part, Madrid specifically. Other people from the very earliest year came from Orange County, Vermont, which is right there, which we'll talk about in just a minute. In 1843, the Powells came from that Madrid, New York to Augusta, Illinois. That's a different part of Illinois than where Foster's was. Oliver Powell came in 1849 to Stillwater, Minnesota, and he brought the first threshing machine. Supposedly, there's number of sources, they say that, north of Prairie du Chien. And they threshed the wheat at the Fisk Farm, which is approximately where the St. Croix Prep School is over in Washington County. Nathaniel came that year and the next to St. Anthony Falls, summer 1849. He hung out in Washington County at first too. He married a teacher, a very early teacher in that area in Bayport, Martha Hart. In November 1849, they located in River Falls Preempt in the south half of the southwest quarter, section 36, township 28, range 19, land lying north of his brother Nathaniel. In 1852, they built a sawmill. The sawmill was located downtown, approximately where the walking bridge is, if you know where the Maple Street and the downtown park is. That's where that sawmill was. This sawmill burned down in 1856, and that'll come back later. The other ones here, they first lived actually by the mound in a small shack. By 1852, they built a house, which I'll talk about on another slide. These ladies here, the Pratt family, over here on the right, she's the oldest person buried at Greenwood Cemetery. She was born in 1776, and she came in 1854 to here, and she had 8 children that were here. and grandchildren already by that point. And then Ora Copeland Powell is actually their stepmother. The Taylors are actually that's their mother. So anyway, I'll talk about her again too. But it wasn't just young people that were coming in the 1850s. There were some older people that lived in the area. After the Powells came, the next settlers were James and Walter Mapes. I don't have a picture of Walter. He was born in 1822, and that's James Mapes, born in 1824. They were in the Mexican War as well. They enlisted in Elmira, New York. James never had active service. They met Joel Foster in the fall of that year, so that would have been in 1849. James stayed. Walter went below for supplies. Walter preempted the section of River Falls, Section 1, where it's just south of here, the main part of River Falls, and then it was bought later. They actually decided to go towards the monument and became the first settlers of Kinnickinnick Township. 3 years later, James, who's pictured there, married Eunice Walden. He got the lumber for their homes when they first built from Osceola. They got land warrants from their military services in the Mexican War. They were Methodists. The early meetings of the Methodists met out on Kinnickinnick at the Walter Mapes house. If you know the church out that way, I believe that's also Methodist. They had quarterly meetings in their barn. The first year they raised 200 bushels of buckwheat on 8 acres, 100 bushels of corn and 75 of potatoes, 80 bushels of oats. Walter Mapes moved to Macon, Missouri in 1866, and they had another brother that ran the Pioneer store, which I'll get to in a little bit. I'm going to read word for word in this next little bit because it talks about like kind of the chronology of between 1850 and when the village gets started. So this is by George Chinnock. Chinnock was an early settler of Troy. That same fall of 1850, Ira Parks and family and James Tozer and family came to the settlement. Also, James Penn and family. Parks took a claim in Section 30 in Kinnickinnick Township near the Mapes brothers and built a shanty in the back of the creek. Penn and Tozer taking claims in Section 25 in Troy, where they built shanties of logs. Other families came at this time. Dr. James Whipple, Lorenzo Daggett, and Mrs. Spraw with their families. In the spring of 1850, Luke H. Pomeroy came to St. Croix County from Illinois in company with 4 others who were employed by William Caddy to drive 10 yoke of oxen and 1 pair of horses, bringing with them breaking balls, wagons, and outfit. They drove up across the state to St. Croix County. Mrs. Pomeroy informs me that it took them 4 days to chop a road through the Bing Woods. There's no doubt Mr. Cady is spoken here of the same man who lived in the little creek from which the town of Cady in St. Croix County derives its name. Mr. Pomeroy worked in about Boyle River until fall, going to New York, returning in the spring with his brother Frank, taking claims in Section 36, Troy Township. Luke Pomeroy building a log house in Kinnickinnick, living in the town 7 years when he built in Troy on the site of his present home. That home is the house that stood until very recent times right by the Kinnickinnick or the vet service on North Main Street. That way. Up to this time, the settlement had been entirely along the Kinnickinnick. After the settlements were made in other parts. In April 51, my father, James Chinnock, came with his family with Ohio and settled in Section 23, Troy Township. There he broke a few acres of land and built a stone house. A few days later, Elisha Walton, coming from the same place, took a claim and built a log house to which they moved the following November. In June 1851, Matthew Harriman took a claim in Section 4, Troy, and Horace Wadsworth took a claim in Section 20, Kinnickinnick. In 1852 came John Scott and Alonsom Day with their families from Pennsylvania and took claims in Section 22, making 4 families in Section 22 and 23 with total population of 22. Those sections are not that far, but it's a little north, but I thought it was worth mentioning. The other side here are Duncan McGregor and Jane Moss McGregor. They're credited as the second settlers of River Falls proper. He's actually Scottish. He was actually a bricklayer and a farmer. He was in the British Army at age 16, Duncan McGregor on the right. In 1844, he came to New Orleans, then Pittsburgh. In 1845, 1848, they were freshly married. These are older pictures of them. he came in 1849 with about 8 others from Canada. He and his wife, the only ones that stayed out of the 7 or 8. The wife would do the cooking, according to Joe Foster's memoir. And McGregor this is Joe Foster's reminiscence. McGregor hung a door, cut a hole for a 6-pane window. He introduced rocking chairs, women, she would be the first woman of any note, and feather beds. They agreed to work together, and they had an agreement. One, if they got logs, they would logs for a house for McGregor, 1 load for him, and 2 for Foster. So Foster got the better deal. He was a singer. He liked to read books. He was the first assessor ever in the district. He was elected the chairman of the town board of councilmen of Hudson, Wisconsin, and also chairman of the county board of St. Clair County. In 1855, he was chairman of the Kinnickinnick, and in 1857, the first chairman of Troy Township, and a member of the county board. So his place was along M, or what's now called I should say, what's now is Paul Avenue, where if you know who Aloha Huffdy was, or Genevieve Rugo, around their property. Now let's move on to getting the village started. So the Pioneer Store, this is a bill on the right of the Pioneer Store. They would get goods from Steamboat to Galena, Illinois, either land at Prescott or at Hudson, and they'd have to deliver it by ox team to River Falls. The Indian Trail was right where Maple Street was, that went between Willow River, Hudson to Maiden Rock. And that's why that Maple Street was picked where that was. Is that where that was? And that's why they did the sawmill there. This is an ad on the very right here for the Pioneer Store, left for the Pioneer Store. These are the Powells again. And then in this middle, this is the ad to settle the village of Kinnickinnick in 1854 that appeared in the Hudson North Star. That's the original name of the plat. The Powells here were not into being retail merchants and wanting to sell things for long, because even that store they did not keep long. They only had it a couple years, and they sold it to others. And there's a lot of history. I'll get to that in the book. I'm not going to say that right now. But anyway, they didn't keep this store that long, and they got others involved with the store. There's no pictures of that store building anywhere. Nathaniel on the left here, he married in 1852. And this is Ava Powell, his daughter. These are the first 2 children pictures of the River Falls area that I've ever come across. She was born in early 1854 and is also sometimes credited as the first white child born. And this is her brother Winthrop, who was born in 1860. They had 2 children. Unfortunately, Nathaniel Powell died in 1862 at a young age. So we think of tuberculosis, but we don't know for sure. This is the original plat of Kinnickinnick here. This is on file at the Register of Deeds office over in Ellsworth. And you can see here, they had a little stone marker here. What we have here is Pine Street, Cedar Street on the north end, Maple, Elm, Walnut, and then Locust. That's the end of the plat. And then we have Main Street, which is a little wider, 2nd Street, and 3rd Street, just the left side of it, or the west side of 3rd Street. That's the original plat of Greenwood. All these names on the left, I went through and seen when people came between 1848 and 59, when they claimed, or I could find evidence of when they approximately were here. So you can see a big amount of people came. This would be the village proper. I'm not talking about townships surrounding. This is how many came each year, and you can see how there was a big rush of people. These people all were from that county in Vermont or that county in New York. And you can go back to the slide presentation later if you want to study and see what these names are. I'm not going to go through that. So what is this place called? It's platted as the village of Kinnickinnick. You may recognize this as the 1880 bird's eye view. I wiped all the buildings with AI, so there's no buildings there anymore, but to get an idea of where are we dealing with here. But this plat was platted down here a little bit later. This part here by Cascade Avenue was platted in 1857 by George Pratt. And then this is the original plat here, and the west side was platted in 1856. So there'll be a couple things. The post office, however, was always called River Falls. River Falls, this is in the Postal Company's record, started February 15th, 1855. Here's somebody sent George Cairns a letter here in early 1855, and you notice it says Kitty-Kanick. 2 months later, from the same person, it says River Falls. So there's always a little confusion about it. It was a long time to change to River Falls. Well, the post office was always called River Falls. The plat was called Kitty-Kanick. Greenwood Falls was another little thing, and the township for a while was called Greenwood because Clark Green and Joseph Wood, they named it. That's why it was called Greenwood. Clark Green was from that Orange County, Vermont, but he removed to Afton, Minnesota already by 1856, and then he actually is buried up at Brooklyn Center. He was in Washington County, but he's buried in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. The other one I really don't know a ton about. I can't find anything about Joseph Wood other than he's Captain Joseph Wood. The Kitty-Kanick name is from a blend of tobacco with local barks of grasses, and you can read more about that in the back there some other time. Let's keep moving. So the start of industry and other things in River Falls has to start out in Clifton a little bit. So we have the Clifton Mill was started by Charles Cox, and there's a picture of him when he's older here, and this is a AI modification to be about how old he would have been, about 40 in 1850 out at Clifton. So they dammed the Kitty-Kanick first at Clifton. This is like an 1870s picture, but I have a real one rather than an AI one. These guys were there. Osborne Straw was also there very early. So who is Osborne Straw? He was from a Quaker family from Belmont County, Ohio. He was interested in education. He came to Chippewa County, Wisconsin to improve his health. He was the first settler at Clifton, and he actually organized the school districts there too, and he named Clifton. So Charles Cox is another early guy. He actually helped build that early Pioneer store too. So did Charles Cox. But Charles Cox was born in New York. He moved to Oswego, New York, and worked at his uncle Samuel Leach's flour mill there. He got into flour business here, and that's why River Falls early was into flour. He actually had a flour mill at Clifton first, sawmill, flour mill, and then he headed in River Falls. Charles married 1836 Margaret Lockwood, who's also very early here. There she is when she's older. I didn't adjust her. They lived supposedly a short time in a cave down at Clifton, and the children were kept in boxes for protection from wild animals. They were like singles. I don't know. They were less than 5 years old at the time. So this is reminiscence from Osborne Straw. This is his words. 1850 was the strange wooden age for wood and brush and thickets in a region around it. Who could handle it the most of it was a lion. We thought we had to fence our land and took piles and piles of timber. It took 2,240 rails to make a warm fence around my 10-acre lot, 32 cords. Custom and ignorance of our rights said we had to fence it. And besides this fencing, I got rails for Charlie Cox that first winter and delivered them in snow up to my knees. But thanks to Uncle Charlie, all the same for the chance to do it. Work was not easily obtained that sparsely settled for tier. Work was life, prosperity, and glory is what I care for. Uncle Charlie Cox came to Clifton with his family in July 1850 and commenced immediately getting out timber for mills. A sawmill the first year and flour mill the second. The flour mill was the first. Instead of eating flour that was made 500 miles away, some of us had raised few bushel of wheat and could afford now to indulge a little merrier appetite. The ox was our first dependence. Mr. Cox could drive, his noble wife could ride behind. But in time a horse was brought in, and the first work was to kick the owner in the face with both feet. And one cold morning, when he was being led to water, knocking him down and leaving him insatiable. When in short time, when he was able to speak, his first words were, "She only did it in play. There's nothing vicious about her at all." The mare ran away to parts unknown, and your humble servant hurried on foot to Hudson for a doctor. And for Mr. Cox's face was badly cut up. He soon regained his health and station, and he kept a mill there for 3 years, selling out to go to a larger field, which is River Falls. He became the member of the Wisconsin legislature, Charlie Cox did, and he had the largest stocks in the academy, which we'll talk about when I get to schools. The land in St. Croix County, just north of the border, like this land, all the way over to the Greenwood Cemetery, that's why I put those in there, were owned by Charlie Cox and his brother Samuel Cox. These are the first two burials at Greenwood that are still marked and we have records for. This is Samuel Cox's brother's child, died in 1850, and this is James Penn, who was talked about. He came in 1850, and their widow Penn will appear later, his widow. So the Powells convinced Charlie Cox to move from Clifton to River Falls, and they built the first flouring mill in River Falls in 1854, and that's the Prairie Mill. The successor of the Prairie Mill building is still there, but that's from 1934. This was a different building. The Prairie Mill was built for $5,500. It really was. He was built by Osborne Straw, the Powells, and Cox. The original mill was 36 by 36 feet, and with two millstones and a wing on the south side of the building. So this is here. The millstones were run by a wooden scroll reel, so you can see the wooden scroll reel on the bottom left with a 12-foot head of water. In 1856, he installed the overshoot wheel. If you don't know what an overshoot wheel, that's what that looks like. And then he used that to do custom work until 1860, and then he started selling the flour in merchant business. And then a turbine engine wheel, this is a little past what we're talking about, but that was installed in 66, and this mill kept running until long after the other ones, into the 1940s or so. At the time, you could get 50 barrels per day at the end when he did this, 1866. In 1860 itself, in the census, it says that they grown 3,600 bushels of corn, 6,000 barrels of flour worth $37,000, and then 3,600 bushels of corn meal worth $2,000. These weren't big employers or anything, because in 1860 he had 3 workers, probably including himself, at that mill. So that's the Prairie Mill. Now, there were other mills getting built as you go. There was a sawmill. This is Joseph Short's house, which is somewhere along Cascade. I have no idea when it went away, but we have a picture of it. And this is Joseph Short's mill, which is along the South Fork. This is the bridge that goes from along the South Fork from the north side to the south, and this is probably Short, but we don't know for sure. This is from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and this is his sawmill. This is an ad on the left that was from the Minnesota newspaper about him being a sawmill, and even in St. Paul, if you need some wood, why don't you come over to Kinnickinnick and get some sawmill from Joseph Short. He was born in 1806, and he actually went to the East and West Indies. He was in Milwaukee. He was 6 months in the California Gold Rush, and then in the summer of 1854, if you see there's a pattern there, he came to River Falls. He had a Short's addition. He had a Short's planning mill along there, and he was all over the place as a guy that ran this mill along there. This is a very rare picture until recently. If we found it down in Madison, that's Joseph Short. So what else do we need to go to build up the town? We need to get a hotel and advertise that you could stay before you build your own place. So this particular drawing here was done in the 1930s by William Fortune on the right. That showed what early River Falls might have been. We have a hotel here, the Greenwood House, which we'll talk about in just a second. We have the Greenwood Mill, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This is the early store, and then this is the Pioneer Store, which is the southeast corner of Main and Maple. This is a diagram of this hotel before it burned in the 1880s. By 1855, we had 3 cards here in the Prescott paper advertising Kinnickinnick: the Prairie Mill, the Flouring Mill, the Kinnickinnick or Pioneer Store, as it was called later, and Oliver and Nathaniel Powell's sawmill. George Cairns had this built. George Cairns was later famous in Ellsworth for a long time. He was a school teacher down in Madison, and he came to River Falls in 1854. He built this and a bunch of other buildings, possibly ones that are still standing. He was a justice of the peace. He was part of the post office, and then he went to Ellsworth in 1859. William Winchester here was born in 1820. He ran this hotel for the first couple of years. He was also from St. Lawrence County, New York. He was twice married. His first wife died, and then he came to River Falls in the fall of 1854, and he returned for his family. He actually enrolled in the Civil War later. He had 2 boys that came with him. In 1854, Justin, his son, was 10, Clinton, 3. This hotel was opened on July 4th, 1855. Winchester sold out of the hotel in 1858. And then this hotel was actually closed during the Civil War. In the time in the 1850s, the board was $4 to $3.50 per week, $1 per day. And there was a dentist that traveled through here. So it's the Greenwood House. Here's an ad for it. Tells you how much it is. $1 per day, $4 per week. So let's go downtown. What's going on downtown? We have a lot of things that were downtown. Sadly, we have no pictures from this early, and all of these buildings that were downtown have been long gone. The one that lasted the longest is this one here. There was a house near what is now Glass Express on the backside that was torn down in 1947. Everything else here pretty much burned at one point or another. So what do we have in downtown? When the River Falls Journal started publishing, we had 4 dry goods stores, 1 tin and sheet metal store, a fine tavern, a large first-class boarding house. That's the one on the north there. A flouring grist mill, planing mill, sawmill, wagon shop, 2 cabinet furniture shops, 1 livery stable, a cooper shop, boot and shoe shop, and a printing office. That would be the journal itself, and shoe shop. So let's go down Main Street and talk about each one here. Here on the bottom left, that's the Greenwood House. This would be Walnut Street. This would be where the Edina Realty is today. On this side of the street here, approximately where the record store is today, Grooves, that's where there was a furniture store. That was Harrison Haven. His ad is on here. Where's his ad? I think it's on here. Up here, yeah. So that was in the middle of the block there. And then this store here was a hardware store started by this guy. This is Sumner Dodge. Dodge Hardware was in River Falls at some point from 1856 to 1955. So a long time. 3 generations of the Dodges ran it, and then somebody named Wilcox ran it for a while too. But that original building is long gone. It would be the one in the middle of the block that's 2-story there on block 9. That was the replacement building. This is the Babcock building here. This is where the River Falls Journal was printed. This is where there was a general store, like the 3rd general store here. There's the Greenwood Mill from the original drawing. I added all this in with AI, but I think it turned out pretty good just to get an idea of what was where. Here's the original Pioneer store. There was a store, the second store, which I forgot to include, was right here. There was a second store built on the north end of the park. And then this one here was the livery barn. There's a livery stable that was ran by David Crane and William Tozer. There a lot of people ran that before it became Lord's Livery for like 30 years. That was in the middle of the block. And then here's Maple Street right here. On the northeast corner of Main and Maple was a drugstore. That is the drugstore there was Lewis and Sanderson. It was built in 1858 for $1,500. Lewis was a doctor. I'll talk about it in a little bit. And then there was Dr. Wilcox, the farmer shop. There was a tailor shop in there. Benjamin Wilcox, which we'll talk about in a little bit. He left books there, so that would be the first predecessor to any kind of library, or you had to pay to get them out of there, but there were books in that building. This is Truman Tuttle's grocery store. It later mostly was used as a home, but what's interesting about Tuttle, he had a milliner, so this is the first female business. Mrs. Babcock actually ran out of here, even though her husband had this building. I don't quite understand that, but that's the way it was. And Truman Tuttle was the first photographer in River Falls, and here's this ad for miniatures, and so that was the Tuttle grocery store there, and photography studio was built on the side of it. So, also, I didn't mention him yet. On the north southeast corner of Maple and Maine. That's him. This is George Griffin. He was the first blacksmith, and he came maybe 1853. He built plows made to order. This is one of his early ads. He actually rents it, but he all the way to 1900 he ran the blacksmith shop. He came from Trumbull County, Ohio in 1851. He landed at Hudson in 1851 with 41 others from that area of Ohio. He made that place his home in Hudson till 53 when he removed to River Falls. And then he actually had a business there like until the place burned down in 1900, which everything tends to do in River Falls. There was a saloon in downtown. It was mentioned a couple different times. There was no name mentioned. I have no idea where it was. It was closed down. So I don't know, have any information on that. What kind of things weren't downtown yet or in businesses in general? There were no restaurants. There were no barbers. There were no meat markets. There was no veterinarian specific or anything like that. That would come out later. So they weren't essential businesses that first decade. What was essential was getting the news out there and getting something established. So the River Falls Journal was established in 1850 by these two brothers. On the right is Lute Taylor, and the left is Horace Taylor. So older brother, younger brother. This is a recreation of approximately what inside the Babcock building would be with them. So there's Lute Taylor and Horace. This is an old picture of him and made him 40 years younger. So there's the original banner for the River Falls Journal and a little thing about the job printing. Where did they come from? They came from St. Lawrence County, New York. Their father was a congregational minister. He died when he was kicked in the head by a horse when Lute was 8 years old. So that's why their mother married the Powell's father. So that's the relationship there. They went to school in Madrid, New York, until 10 years of age, and then they went to Hancock County, Illinois. They worked on farms up here. They saved $300, returned to St. Lawrence County, and went to Potsdam University. That's Horace Taylor on the left. He went to Potsdam University. 18, he returned to River Falls. He had the stagecoach between here and Hudson, and he would deliver the mail because the mail was open in 1855. How do you get it? You have to get it on steamboat. And then you had to deliver it here on the horse with Taylor. That was the first one. And sometimes at Prescott, too, he would get the mail. I don't know how they picked that. He actually decided to make a newspaper with his brother by 1857, and they had the first paper June 13th, 1857. He was about 21 years of age. Horace would sell out before the end of the 1850s, and he would run the Hudson paper for a number of years, all the way into, I think, the 1890s, and then he would move to Madison and run the Madison State Journal. So Lute Taylor would keep the River Falls paper going until 1861, but he decided the business and the growth here wasn't that great. That's part of the reason, at least. So he actually closed the River Falls Journal in 1861 and moved his print shop to Prescott and started the Prescott Journal. There wouldn't be another River Falls Journal for about 12 years. Lute Taylor, I'll talk about later again. So, yeah. So that's the River Falls Journal. Now, let's talk a little bit about schools. There were actually 8 school districts already established in River Falls Township by the time of 1860. The first school was taught by Mrs. Cassandra Dyer, which was then Mrs. Cassandra Van Meter, age 17, of Hudson in 1853. Alice will talk about that right now in her own words.
These are the words of Mrs. Cassandra Dyer. In 1853, I made my first venture as a schoolma'am in the Kinnickinnick Valley, north of River Falls. My schoolroom was one of a 2-room house. The other room was occupied by a young couple whose name I do not recall. My room was a bare little plain with no backboard. No desk nor curtains. We did the best we could with the books the different families brought with them, supplemented by those I brought from home, an Adams arithmetic and Kirkham grammar. I started in with about a dozen boys and girls from 6 to 15 years of age. Among those who attended my hall of learning were Freeman Lord, Charles Sherburne, James and Adeline Tozer, Dan, John, and Ellen Park, Anne and Tom Chunnock, Lydia Scott, Dwight Burnett, Julia Day, Henry and Helen Daggett. Louis Perrin was superintendent. One day he walked into my room, walked home with me, and wrote a teacher's certificate. No fuss, no tiresome examination, just a quiet little transaction. The district was so scattered that boarding around was out of the question, so I had my home with the Park family. For my services, I received $2 a week and board.
Alice will be back shortly, but I got to print this. So that's a school which I don't know the exact location of, but the first school in the village itself was on 4th Street on the eastern end of its village plat. The address I thought we put on here, 122 4th Street. Do I have it in my notes? No, but it's on 4th Street. This is the house that sits there now. This is approximately what it looked like. And this is, that's two views of the house. This is approximately what it looked like on 4th Street. There wasn't anything else on 4th Street at the time. It was built by public subscription of $500, and it was frame building of 20 by 30. The first teacher was Helen Flint. Helen taught one term, married Royal Dean. They moved to Dover, Illinois. The district was formally organized the next year, and there were a number of other teachers. It was said by the end of the 1850s, there were 60 students in one room, one teacher and one assistant in this little building on 4th Street. Here is Alice.
As to society, we are at least half civilized. This is from March 10th of 1855. When I came here in May last year, there was no place for public worship except the cases of the first declarations, and meeting were held but seldom and without regularity. But during the fall, a good schoolhouse, 24 by 30 feet, 12-foot posts, was erected at a cost of about $400 by private subscription. A term of 3 months just closed at our new schoolhouse. It was taught by a female teacher at $3 per week and board. It was not a district school, but was supported by rate bill. A school district has just been organized in a term of 5 months for the summer. The first meeting to be taught by a female. In addition to the winter term, just closed, in addition to the common English branches, algebra, Latin, and philosophy were also taught. We have the free school districts in Wisconsin, and liberal provisions have been made for the state funds already amounts to nearly $3,000 in the future by increasing the amount of lands appropriated to that fund. As a general thing, the people are awake on the subject of education. Read the next part. 60 years later, in 1914, Helen Flint recalled that school. The schoolhouse was very plain but comfortable. It has a row of desks for scholars on 3 sides. I cannot remember how many scholars I had, but I think there were several of my relatives. I remember the wages I received, $14 a month and board. At first, they thought they couldn't afford to pay so much, but they did.
So that schoolhouse was used for the first 11 years at least of the River Falls School District, and then it's unclear if they continued to use that for a bit, but it was transformed, and that's later history, so I'm not going to talk about that. But the other thing that they were wide awake with was with upper education, past 8th grade. So they started something called the Academy by private subscription. There were 65 people in number in 1856 wanting to build the building where now the Montessori, and it's sometimes called the Academy, I believe still today, is built. So there's 56 people already wanting to do that. They actually hired S.S. Ferris of Hudson to build the building for $3,100 building. $3,100. It was completed on November 18th, 1856, and there was about a seating capacity of 3,300 with a main room and a resuscitation rooms. They had trouble finishing the top floor, and that really wasn't finished until after the Civil War. There were 239 shares at $10 a share. They had to go, and the chairman of that committee was Charles Cox. George Cairns was the secretary. I talked about those guys already. Benjamin Wilcox was the guy that took charge of it. He was supposed to do it for 3 years and then continue it like that, and he was there for 4 years total. Sadly, the school kind of failed. There was rent, you had to pay $1 per student. There was a panic in the air with the dollars in 1858, 59. He actually left River Falls in November 1862, leaving the Academy building with the Bible. The original Academy records, where all those stockholders' names are over at Archives. It's pretty interesting. It was actually, that building was voted to give to the school district in 1865, 125 votes for it, and 18 against for dissolving the academy and selling it to the school district for $1,500. Who is Benjamin Wilcox, the main teacher there? He was from Cromwell, Connecticut. He was teacher at 16. He graduated William College in 1841. He first taught at Yates, New York, and then 11 years at Wilson, New York. He married, but his wife died at age 29 in Wilson. They had 2 children, and when he came here, Edward, his son, was 11, and Willis was 8. He remarried his first wife's sister, and then had a daughter, Helen, and then they moved here. The last child was born in River Falls in 1858. After leaving River Falls, he was principal of a high school in Valparaiso, Indiana. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I didn't study that name. Then in 1870 at South Bend, Indiana. He died in 1875, age 60. This picture of him on the left was in a 1937 Kinnick yearbook. So somebody local, when the high school was 50 years, still had a picture of him. This I found online later in a history book for Indiana. So that's Benjamin Wilcox. The academy was a good thought, but it was kind of a failure overall and eventually sold to the district. Other things that were going on is we had some other milling. What was Joe Foster doing after 1850? He built a sawmill in 1854, and it kept going all the way until a flood in 1895. This is underneath what would now be Lake George. So you could see the house, and there's the mill, and there's a big sawmill there. It was 40 by 78 feet, 4 floors. So it's pretty substantial one. The first and second were for sawing and planting and turning. That's not AI, that's a real picture. Half the second and all the third was for machinery. So Harry Cornish actually had a turning shop there. That's what I have here, this little ad on the left. And then Charlie Cox, which we talked about earlier, after Paul's sawmill burned, this was right downtown, right where River Falls Days food trucks and all that are, right along the Kinney. They had the dam rebuilt there. That was really the first dam for that sawmill of Paul's, and then later for the Greenwood Mill. The Greenwood Mill was also with somebody from Hudson built, Caleb Green. It was run as a custom mill, 2 run of stone, 8 run of head. He bought the water power from the Pauls for $3,000. The work, they actually had 3 stories, 34 by 50 feet. And in 1860, there was 20,000 bushels of wheat done there, and they had 4 workers at this mill. How did they get the flour out of River Falls once they had it, and there was no railroad or anything like that? It was shipped by mule team. It's hauled to the lakes on St. Croix to ship to St. Louis along the river. And then they had many teams to transfer flour to Hudson to be loaded on cars, brought it for Chicago once the railroad there was built in 1871. The mills had their own cooper shops. So that's another mill that was running. What about churches in the area? Early in 54, there was a meeting to start the Congregational Church, which is the earliest one. And I'll talk about this building after Alice comes up here and talks about the very early part of it.
Churches. Congregational. In April of 1854, three families, those of Asaph Pratt, Mrs. Flint, and Joseph Nichols, came to take up their abode in the beautiful Kinnickinnick Valley. There was no schoolhouse or church and only one dwelling, the home of Nathaniel and Oliver Powell. Horace Wadsworth was living on his farm up the valley and, hearing of the three new families, walked over the mound one Sunday to see what sort of people they were. He came to Mrs. Flint's shanty, where she and Mr. Pratt's people were living. My aunt, Mrs. Pratt, who was bitterly opposed to Sunday visiting, said, "There comes another Sunday visitor." But when she found that his errand was to talk of starting a Sunday school, she was very glad to welcome him. From that small beginning, a Sunday school was organized, the first one being held in Widow Penn's home, a house standing on the farm so long owned by Allen Weld. We also met Mrs. Tozer's log house. At the time of the building of the church, a dreadful accident happened. Timothy Edwards was getting the log timbers for the church when one of the trees fell, crushing both of his legs, causing his death. There were no trained nurses at that time, and the care of this good brother was a labor of love from his neighbors. 12 men went to the big woods and brought him to his daughters on a litter, a journey of 6 miles. 6 men carrying at one time and changing with the other 6 as the burden became too heavy. After many tries, the church was completed. We have received a small benefit from the Church Building Society, and the dedication took place July 4, 1858. Elmira Nichols Powell.
That was Oliver Powell's wife. She came in 1854 too, obviously. So that was a very early church. The congregation was started in 1855 officially, and so there's the original names of who was in that church. They actually had a couple different pastors in the 1850s. Oh, that's what's missing here, the pastor picture. Oh well. So there was a pastor named Reverend Stevens. One story is he would sit in his study and wait to see when church started, when Lyman Powell, which is another brother to Oliver and Nathaniel's, horses came over the hill, which he would start for church. One Sunday, Powell didn't go to church. He didn't realize what time it was, and a concerned parishioner knocked, wondering what was wrong with the pastor. They lived at the Solomon Brewers. So they lit this building here is a description. There's no pictures of it. This was about where Mariachi Loco is today, around that area. I don't know exactly where it was, but that's approximately where it was. And this building, when it was replaced in the 1880s, was moved to 2 different places on Main Street and used for other purposes, and eventually torn down in 1907. The Methodists started and first met at the house of William Tozer. This is the second house they met at, and it stands on 2nd Street. This is at Gulf, whatever, near the Stitchery place. This is Samuel Rollins' house. So the Methodists first met there. There were about 12 people that were in the Methodist part. They alternated at the school at 4th Street that we talked about, and meeting at the Congregational Church once those were built. They also they built a building on the corner of Walnut and 2nd, but it was boarded up during the Civil War because there was no money for it. The Baptists started. I don't have any picture there for the Baptists. It was a branch of Hudson. They were started in 1857. They built a church in 1859. It was on the corner of Maple and 4th, and it was completed in 62. Just barely in the 50s, there was the Trinity Church. This is a church on the west side. Now it's converted into a home. This was built in 71, but this is Joel Foster's church. This always had a small membership, but it ran all the way till 2005 as a thing. And they had McCleary, Webster, Sanders, Joseph Short was in that church, Foster's, Putnam's. Those were the early people. And they also met at the Glass Valley Schoolhouse early on, which is, if you know where Glass Valley is, southwest of town, there's a cemetery. There was a school, or whichever way that is. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm moving a little fast. We did have some doctors here. The first doctor ever was Dr. Davis here in the middle. There's no picture of him. He had an office Dr. Andrews, eventually was a surgeon in the Civil War. He was also our first mayor when this became the city, and he died in office in 1885. I could go on about him. Dr. Venata, he's always called doctor in the paper, but he quit practicing pretty much by 1855, but he's there as a showing, Dr. Venata. So his family is, I lived on Cascade Avenue, and this Dr. Lewis, I really didn't know a ton about. I found his card and I forgot about him, but turns out he was from Mankato. He came here for a short time. This is his picture from like 1902, so I de-aged him. Does he look the same? Probably on the right. I don't know. But he was born in Clyde, New York, and he came here from Rush Medical College, and he went to college in New York City. He went abroad already. He came to Mankato before he came here and after. He was he had one daughter that was born here, and then when he was a partnership in that drugstore downtown, and when that burned down in '64, he left permanently to go keep in Mankato. What was going on for events and organizations in River Falls at the time? So groups that were established in the 1850s were things like the Philanthropic Society, the Ladies Sewing Circle, the Republicans, the Democrats, a Village Lyceum Society, the Greenwood Cemetery Association, that's the one of the two things that are still running, and then the Masons. This is the first list of the Masons that was established in '58. So that's who that is. There was a Franklin Society, a Freeman Club. There was no mention of any sports of any kind that early. The first 4th of July celebration in River Falls was at Harts Grove. This would have been to the south, eastern side of the city that was near that schoolhouse. So they called that the Fairgrounds or Harts Grove, or also the 4th of July would be held there. So this is Lute Taylor, supposed to be Lute Taylor by the little schoolhouse. This is an actual bill for the 57, July 4th. There's also a trotting park over there because they actually had the first 3 fairs over there. So there are 3 different July 4th celebrations in the 1850s besides that early one with the pig with Joel Foster, 56, 57, 58. In this one, 1857, Benjamin Wilcox was orator, and the Toastmaster was Abner Morse. Horace Taylor toasted the soldiers of the Revolution, Charles Cox to the Great West and its future prospects. Nothing slower than a locomotive could overtake her. During this celebration, when Old Glory was being raised, the rope got off the pulley and the wedge in between and the side of the pole, so it could not be raised or lowered. Bummer. The flag was at half-mast. The pole was too slender to climb, and what to do was a conundrum. Joseph Sharp came to the rescue with his telescope rifle. The first shot cut the wood away so you could see the rope. The second shot knocked the pulley out, leaving the rope unharmed. Then the flag was raised to the top amidst the cheers of the crowd. Cheer, yeah! And so this was used for July 4th. Other events were these early fairs on September 24th. 1856, the St. Croix Valley Fair, the first of its kind, was held on the Farmers and Mechanics of the St. Croix Valley. There are actually, in the 1856 Prescott paper, they list everybody who won something that year. 125 different articles. There was cattle, horses, ladies' needlework. They displayed stuff in the schoolhouse, garden products. Paul was the recording secretary. It was by the schoolhouse. I already talked about that. This next year was the same place. And the third fair was in 1858, and then it was moved to Prescott. And I don't know, somebody probably is an expert of St. Croix County when the next fair was in St. Croix County. I don't know that off the top of my head. They also had a trotting park over there, so that, I guess that's closest to anything to sports. That was on the east side before the famous one. If you see the bird's eye view of 1880, there's one over by the Armory, but that wasn't built till 1871. So there's some events, a little bit of some groups, and let's end with a little bit of what is left from this world. Here's a picture or a map I drew or put together. All these mean different things, but there's the church approximately where that is, the brown one. The yellow one is the school on 4th Street, the academy on the west side. All these little black dots are where I think houses are. There's other colors down here that indicate Main Street businesses here. this is the house. This would be Division Street right here. This is the oldest house on the west side. I'll show you that in a minute. There's a few houses here. There's barely anything over here. There's maybe 6 houses here, the Academy on the west side, and then maybe, I don't know, 20 some houses on this side and a few to the south here. I don't know on downtown. There's a couple that I marked black. I don't know if those were houses, but there is a building there, and those people did not have businesses to my knowledge at that time. So I don't know if they actually built on those downtown blocks. This is an example of everything that was built in 1858 on the right. That's how much it cost to build and what it was. So what's still left? So we have a few different houses around town that are still very few at this point. We have 107 South 3rd Street. This house is the oldest house, my opinion, of River Falls. This was built for both Nathaniel and Oliver Powell when they opened the Pioneer store. They could no longer live there. They lived there 2 years. It wouldn't make sense for them to live downtown at the Pioneer store. So they had a house built on 3rd Street because they just had it platted. Let's get some houses going. And this is credited in their biographies and other things that the first 2-story building and the first 2-story house. So that later when Nathaniel moved to the west side, Oliver moved to 4th Street, their brother Lyman lived there, and then later their relatives, the Wells, lived there, and it's been a rental for I don't know how long. This is 409 Sydenham 2nd. This was by a man named Alva White, built 1857. He died that same year, and just this front part was part of it. He was a first shoe dealer. This is the Jenks house, 213 South 3rd Street. He had a planing mill around town. I think he's the earliest owner. That was built in 1857. That was near Foster's Sawmill. He partnered with Foster. This is the Winchester house. I talked about him. He was with the hotel downtown. Part of this, at least, was the Winchester house. That's on Walnut Street. That's built 1857 or so. There's a house on Lewis Street, which I think is John Shade's house. John Shade had a father that was named William Shade, who had a mill on the Trimble River down near Beldenville, west of Beldenville. On Park Street, there's a very old house by Philip Sane. This is the Park Street address, 209 Park. Philip Sane was a very early Methodist, and he was actually in the Black Hawk War in Grant County in the 1830s. He left and he built things around here. He actually went for Washington and Oregon Territory before 1870. I found his picture though. This house is interesting because it didn't always sit here. 425 Main Street or Pine Street was built in 1856 on the corner of Pine and Main Street, where the house is by Dollar General today. When Franklin Rosenberg built his house there in 1895, he had this one moved up to Pine Street in 1895. So that was the Tozer house. I talked about the Tozers being part of the early settlement and the Methodists. So this house was moved, and it's very early. This is the first house built on the west side. Doesn't look like this anymore. This Greek Revival style is a key thing to show that. It was built in 1856 for Nathaniel Powell, showing that, yes, you should build on the west side too, because we just platted it and we got to do something with the west side. So this is highly modified. Anderson's lived there recent years. Sadly, not everything survives. And 3 out of these 4 houses have all been torn down, one just this past week. So 431 2nd Street was built for Charlie Cox in 1858, and it's been added on. A mayor lived there. The next Miller, John Putnam, lived there. Unfortunately, it was made into a rental in 1907, and as far as I could tell, it's been a rental since 1957. So it was torn down because they had a fire there this May. I thought it was going to go out with a roundabout in a couple of years, and I actually contacted that family. Long story. This house was torn down for the Sycamore. This was an 1850 house, Greek Revival. That was Daniel Leving's house. That family, the Levings, had that house for 100 years. plus because they recognized for it. It eventually became a rental, sit next to the thing, and I don't know who sold it to make the Sycamore, but that's what that one is. This one was just on North Main by the vet place. I don't know why. That was the Pomeroy house, one of them, and that was torn down in recent years. This is the only one standing on this slide. This is the Samuel Rollins house. This is where the Methodists met early on, before they had a church built, and it's still standing. I don't know the whole chronology of it. Beyond that, you can see the Greek Revival style and that it is very old. The next one to it was a greenhouse eventually, and that's the story for another time. So there are about 8 houses left. That mostly concludes my talk. So what happened after 1860-61? Civil War happened. Sadly, this is the River Falls Rifle Company. It's not identified. I'm not going to get into the Civil War. That's another whole talk. So, but we went from about one person to around 300 in the village between 1848 and 1860-61 when the Civil War broke out. That is it.
Dan, first, I just want to thank you for all the research you've done, the compiling of information, and willingness to discuss all of this. We do have time for just a couple questions. Does anyone have something they would like to ask? Right here in the front. That weirded you out across. The most surprising or interesting thing that you found while you were doing your research that possibly weirded you out? Anything that sticks in your head?
I don't know if it weirded me out, but it was a surprise to me because I wasn't sure about those early schools. So that whole story about the school north of River Falls, I was randomly reading the Hudson Centennial issue of 1954 for their paper. Wasn't expecting to find anything about River Falls in it, but that's where that story came from because the lady was from Hudson. So I don't know if it weirded me out, but I was very surprised that school was before the village school here in town.
The question is about the monument. Actually, there's quite a bit that back here in the display cases, and that is someone owns the land that it's on. It's on private property. Dan, you want to add to that?
I've never personally been there, so I can't speak too much of it. I know I've seen it from afar. But yeah, it's on private property. I don't even know the owners, and it's not in town. So it's just that Joe Foster could see it. So that's why it was in my talk at all. So you could see it he wasn't down in the valley. He was out where he could see it from the west side. Yeah, pine trees all around it today. One more question, and then we'll turn off the recording, I think.
My great-grandfather bought the portion from the Greenwood Mill, and then he used it to build the barn on our farm.
So we have a first-hand account of her grandfather, great-grandfather, bought the wood, salvaged. Okay, sold the good pieces for money, and then built their barn with the scrap. And the barn is still there.
Saying the Greenwood Mill lives. Side commentary, that was torn down in 1935 for context. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Dan's got one more little tidbit of information about a presentation that he's doing, a cemetery tour, local, that is still happening this weekend, and then some other opportunities for you to connect. Otherwise, we're going to wrap it up here. And if you'd like to come up and talk some more, I'm going to ask you to kind of stay this way, just avoid the courts.
So I decided to do this talk because of the semi-quincentennial, and I also, because I'm on the Greenwood Cemetery Board, there will be a cemetery tour in 2 days in the morning at 10 o'clock. You're welcome to come. There's a free will donation. You don't have to, you can pay what you want or don't pay. It doesn't matter to me. So you just meet, you park at Greenwood School, and then you walk over if you're able. If you need handicap parking, we'll deal with that. I'm giving this talk, or very similar, at the Sycamore, or not at the Sycamore, at Comforts of Home on July 17th at 1 p.m. So if you really want to hear this again or similar, you can come there. Saturday, July 11th, 10 a.m. Yep. Do you want to wrap it up for the...
Thanks for joining us. Enjoy River Falls Days.